already looked at the formation, structure, and had an overview understanding of the United Nations organization. In this lesson, we would be looking at the various aims, objectives, and principles of the United Nations. The United Nations Charter is the constitution of the United Nations. And like every other constitution, it starts with a preamble. The purpose of a preamble is to enshrine the spirit of the entire constitution. The preamble of the United Nations starts with the following words. We, the peoples of the United Nations, determine to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. Thus we understand that this is the core aim of the United Nations, the idea behind the formation of the United Nations, to save further generations from war, to ensure and maintain world peace, and to also enhance the development of humankind. Over here is a stamp of the United Nations, which showcases these very words of the preamble of the Charter. Now that we have understood that the preamble gives us the very core aim or the idea behind the United Nations, let's see how the Charter tells us what the objectives of the United Nations are. The UN Charter gives us the following few objectives. First and foremost is the establishment of international peace and security. Then is the achievement of international cooperation. Next is the development of friendly relations among states or member states. Then the UN wishes to ensure fundamental human rights. And finally, the UN wishes to enhance economic and cultural development. So these are the objectives of the United Nations, what it wishes to achieve. These objectives of the United Nations are stated in Article 1, or the very first article of the UN Charter, thus giving us an idea that the objectives of the United Nations, or what it wishes to do, are to be understood before even understanding what the UN truly is. Now, can you answer this question? Which article of the UN Charter contains the objectives of the UN? Article 1, Article 5, Article 4, or Article 10? The correct answer is Article 1. Now that we have looked at the objectives of the UN, let's look into few of them in detail to understand how does the UN aim to achieve these objectives. The first and foremost objective, as mentioned, is to maintain international peace and security. This was the reason the United Nations was founded. But how does the UN aim to achieve this? In order to establish and maintain peace, one has to make sure that any threats that can violate peace are being removed or are being prevented. Therefore, the United Nations aims to prevent and remove any such threats which can violate peace. This could be through counter-terrorism, through the establishment and maintenance of fundamental human rights, and in general keeping an eye out for whatever can threaten peace. But what if a state of conflict already exists between two nations or two parties? How can the United Nations prevent a conflict when it already is occurring? Well, the United Nations' objective to maintain international peace and security is not just preventive. And in fact, if the need calls for it, the United Nations can suppress acts of aggression. But how does the UN do it? The UN suppresses such acts of aggression by passing resolutions of the United Nations Security Council, which is the executive wing of the UN, and by deploying peacekeeping troops. Now, the peacekeeping troops are like the army of the United Nations, made up of armed forces of all the nations who are the members of the UN, and which acts as an army for the world, but only aims to establish international peace. So it goes on to suppress such acts of aggression, so peace is established and maintained. But what if suppressing an act of aggression is not enough to maintain international peace and security? Most such aggressions are caused by long-standing disputes, often within nations or among nations. What does the United Nations do in that case? Well, the United Nations also acts as a forum or platform for dispute resolution. And this it does in a peaceful manner. For centuries, the only form of dispute resolution was war. The United Nations changes this conception as it acts as a forum for the peaceful settlement of disputes which are based on the principle of justice and ensured by international law. But in a world we live in, where dangerous armaments like nuclear weapons exist, can there truly be the maintenance of peace and security in the world? How does the UN pursue its objective in the world we live in? Well, the United Nations aims to achieve the maintenance of international peace and security by pushing or by insisting and urging for disarmament, especially disarmament of nuclear weapons among nations. This is an installation that stands in front of the United Nations headquarters in New York. This particular statue represents the idea of disarmament. As you can see, the barrel of this pistol is tied up in a bow. And this particular statue standing in front of the United Nations headquarters means that the United Nations aims for disarmament. The United Nations also aims to develop friendly relations among states or nation states. That is because international peace and security could never be maintained if the ones responsible for this maintenance, the nations, are fighting amongst each other and are plotting to overtake their own rival nations. But how does the United Nations aim to achieve this development of friendly relations? Well, the UN aims that these friendly relations should be based on some ground of mutual respect for each other. And this mutual respect should particularly be towards the sovereignty of other nations, the equality of other nations, and also the self-determination of people of the other nations. And most importantly, such friendly relations should not become an excuse for the interference into the domestic affairs of another nation. Thus, we understand that the UN aims to develop such friendly relations among nations on the basis of mutual respect, especially on the principle of equality or equal rights and self-determination of people, and most importantly, the principle of non-interference. The UN also wishes to teach all nations a crucial lesson, that of tolerance, so that the nations do not take up arms and declare war at the first chance they get. So the United Nations teaches all nations to practice tolerance and to live together in peace. Thus, in simple words, the United Nations aims to establish an environment of peaceful coexistence of all nations of this world. But simply developing friendly relations among nations is not enough. There needs to be international cooperation. The United Nations needs to unite all nations and to make them work together for the maintenance of peace, as that is a core aim of the United Nations. Thus, the United Nations wishes to achieve international cooperation among nations, and this it wishes to achieve through dialogue or interaction among member states. And in case of this dialogue or interaction among nations, the United Nations wishes to become the primary platform for such international interactions. Think of this like a classroom discussion where every student is representing a nation and they are all coming together to solve international problems. Similarly, the purpose of this international cooperation is also to solve the problems of the world. Particularly, this international cooperation of the United Nations is aimed at solving international economic problems, social issues, cultural threats, or humanitarian crises. And as mentioned before, the UN wishes to become the primary forum to achieve such international cooperation and to solve such global problems. But how can the United Nations on its own solve so many problems? Well, for this purpose, the United Nations has specialized agencies. These are like independent organizations which are associated with the United Nations, each having its own specialized function. These specialized agencies of the UN includes the UNICEF, which acts as a forum of international cooperation for the welfare of the mother and child, UNESCO, which acts as a forum of international cooperation for the educational, scientific, artistic and cultural development of humankind, and WHO, which acts as a forum of international cooperation for the global public health. So these are a few of the United Nations specialized agencies. To know more about such specialized agencies, you can click on the link below to access the iDictionary feature. The Second World War and its horrors brought to light a fact that fundamental or basic human rights are not universally respected. The Holocaust marked the deaths of 17 million individuals, including the 6 million European Jews, and this left the world in shock. After the war, the world came together in a concerted effort to create an organization to establish and maintain international peace, and to also act as a forum for the maintenance of the fundamental human rights. Now, why are some of the rights called fundamental? This is because these are the rights that are available to a human being since their birth. The basic qualification to access these fundamental human rights is just to be born as a human being. And thus no one should be able to take this away from us. And they're fundamental for our overall development. And the UN ensures that such fundamental human rights should be available or should be extended to all, as it belongs to all of us, and should also be beyond discrimination. Therefore, it should be irrespective of race, sex, language, or religion, because these fundamental human rights are, as mentioned, for all. Some of these fundamental human rights include the right to freedom, the right to equality, the right to live and that too with dignity, the right to education, the right to fair justice, the right to food, and the right to speech. And to make sure that the world respects these fundamental human rights, the United Nations wishes to form the basis on international law and to provide the world a framework, a document which acts as the basis for the maintenance of fundamental human rights. The United Nations finally achieved this aim of creating a framework, a document for the maintenance of fundamental human rights on 10 December 1948, when the General Assembly, the legislative organ of the United Nations, the General Assembly of the United Nations, announced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is often called the UDHR. This was a document which enshrined 30 important rights and freedoms that are available to us all, as they are the fundamental human rights and freedoms. This particular document was drafted by a special committee of the United Nations General Assembly, which is led by Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the wife of the American President Franklin Roosevelt and also the permanent representative of the United States of America to the United Nations. We see over here Lady Eleanor Roosevelt holding the UDHR, or the document of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for the international press. Here we stand 7 decades from the passing of the UDHR, and the fundamental freedoms and rights that were enshrined in this document still make the basis for international human rights law. The United Nations was formed after the Second World War, but 7 odd decades have passed since the formation of the organization. So let us look at these new objectives of the United Nations, which it particularly focuses on and which were added later on. The first such objective is to decolonize the entire world, which aims to eliminate any form of colonization, old or new, of the world, where every nation needs to have its own sovereign identity and should not be dependent on another nation which subjugates it. We already saw how disarmament is an aim to achieve international peace and security. And therefore disarmament, more than anything, is one of the most important objectives of the United Nations to truly achieve international peace and security. And the final new objective is the development of the world. This maintenance of international peace and security is not enough. If the world is coming together and they're cooperating, they should work to develop the world, so that not only can any form of conflict be avoided, but all people and all nations come together to truly ensure an environment of overall prosperity. Now, the United Nations wishes to achieve its various objectives and aims by listing down some principles. These principles are to be kept in mind by the United Nations itself, and also needs to be followed by all the member states who join the United Nations. So let us look at these principles as has been given to us by the United Nations Charter. The first principle is the recognition of sovereignty and equality of all members. The United Nations cannot be biased towards some members and unfair towards the others. All nations are equal in the UN, and everyone has its own sovereignty or authority over its own domestic affairs. Next is the peaceful settlement of disputes. The United Nations acts as a forum for the settlement of disputes, but this settlement of disputes needs to be done in a peaceful manner. Now, in this current date, the majority of the world is a member of the United Nations. When the United Nations was formed, there were only 51 members. Therefore, there was a principle that even if all nations do not become a part of the United Nations, the UN itself has to ensure that such non-members should act in accordance to the principles. They do not need to join the United Nations, but they should not do anything which is in violation of these basic principles, as these principles form a basis of global order among all nations. And the member states who join the United Nations should keep in mind that they should always avoid at any cost the use of violence in any form whatsoever. The United Nations Charter is the spirit of the United Nations, and therefore the sanctity of the Charter needs to be maintained, and thus all member nations must respect the UN Charter. The UN is to act as a forum for international cooperation, and therefore all the member nations in whatever capacity possible should help the United Nations in its functions and must not act as a blockade for the UN to establish or achieve its aims. Finally, the United Nations is an international organization, but it is not a form of government of all the nations. It is not a global governance organization, and therefore, even though the member states are following the principles of the UN, they have their own sovereignty and their own domestic affairs. And by the UN Charter, the United Nations should not interfere in the internal affairs of the member countries and thus practice non-interference. This policy of non-interference is also applicable to the member states as well, so that they do not interfere in the internal affairs of other nations while trying to establish friendly relations. In this lesson, we saw the core aim of the United Nations, the various objectives listed down in the UN Charter, and also the various principles the UN needs to establish to ensure and achieve its objectives. In the next lesson, we would learn about the various organs of the United Nations and understand how does the UN properly function. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it is rewarding too. So register for free now.